at any point. It's really so nice. But those of you that have chosen not to. But today's a special webinar. We've got RunWalk, Indigenous RunWalk program folks here, as well as the Honor Your Health Challenge folks. And the topic today is to just address some of those things that you can experience in your body when you embark on a physically active kind of program. So I'm just going to quickly share that the other night we had a webinar Zoom chat with the Indigenous RunWalk group in Penticton with Obi, and just here's me, coach with oodles of experience and giving advice constantly, and I was so just kind of enthusiastic and inspired by the folks that are going to begin the RunWalk program there in Penticton. And the actual program itself began in Penticton, you know, many years ago. And so I got off the phone, and our mentor and my dear friend in Denise LaCoy and the LaCoy family were all on there, and they were the reasons for the program to gain interest right off the bat and to make a start. But they were saying right on the webinar, we want to make a start tonight, right after the webinar. We're going to go for a run walk.
Yeah, they did.
They did. And so then for me, I didn't go that night, but the next day I thought, I'm going out, and I felt so excited. And all the advice I'm always sharing with all of you is no huffing and puffing allowed. Make sure you can carry on a conversation. Take that breath, listen to your body, stay comfortable. And if something reacts in your body, listen to it, pay attention to it. Well, I went out there and I just ran too hard. I was so excited. I ran hard. I began to feel something. First, I was huffing and puffing. That was enough. I slowed down. That was fine. But then already I began to feel something a little bit in my calf muscle. And I realized, oh my gosh, Lynn, listen to what's happening, just as I explained to all of you. And enthusiasm is great, but we don't want discomforts. We don't want aches and pains to become something that they shouldn't. And I knew enough to stop and just walk. I was running. I knew enough to walk back home, and I'm fine. But I thought, how perfect that today our guest is a friend to the South Surrey White Rock community where I live. And in fact, I had the privilege of coaching his son, who in fact was the youngest leader training participant this year for Indigenous RunWalk at our leader training back some months ago in Calum. So our guest is a well-known physiotherapist in our community. He himself is very active, going to go for a bike ride this afternoon, he said, as a matter of fact. Runner, triathlete extraordinaire, but he has a fabulous Physio Moves clinic. And so he's going to share with us ways to pay attention to our body and what kinds of things we need to prevent from happening. So without further ado, I'm so glad this is Tyler Dumont, and he's there on your screen about to present for us. And please mute your mics as we do, because that prevents any kind of just sort of, just waves interfering with the sound for everybody. And use the chat if you have a question, especially if it's right pertinent to what's being discussed right then and there. We'll try and address it, but we will save time to answer further questions afterwards. And we do have a draw prize, Susan. We have a draw prize, which happens at the end as well. So stick with us for this next time period as best you can. Okay. Okay, Tyler, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Lynn. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and hello to all of you. My goal, as Lynn mentioned, was just to share some information with you to help prevent getting into injuries and soreness, and then what to do when you do start to get some discomfort or pains. So I'll share my PowerPoint slides here, and we'll just sort of talk our way through it. So hopefully you can see that. Everyone can see that? Great. So I always like to sort of lay out a road map here of what we're going to cover. So I'm just going to talk about our body's amazing ability to adapt, and some, we'll talk about when we're maybe overloading and causing injury. We'll talk about some of the common risk factors for injury with walking and running, some of the most common injuries that we see, as well as some of the strategies to help prevent getting into trouble. And then always the tricky one is how to interpret your discomfort or pain and what to do next. And then I'll take lots of questions at the end if you have them, or again, if you have a burning question during the presentation, I'm happy to answer it then. So one of the first things is thinking about our body's ability to adapt. It's always interesting to think about it, but our body is continually adapting to how we're using it or how we're loading it. If you think of a bodybuilder, they've over the years gradually lifted more and more weight, and their muscles have adapted and gradually gotten bigger and stronger. And if they stop lifting the weights, those muscles gradually get smaller and shrink again. So depending on our activity levels, our body's always adapting. So I think of that in terms of our muscles getting stronger and bigger. I think of that as our tendons even, they will adapt to how we load them. And even our bone density, if we think about how strong our bones are, if we stop, jumping and running and doing impact, our bones get weaker. But if we start doing that again, our bones get stronger. So our body's always changing with how we use it. And the challenge can be when you start any kind of fitness program is not to overload our body and give it enough chance to recover and adapt and get stronger and stronger. And it's really easy to overload sometimes. So for example, Lynn's example is a great one. You're feeling super energetic, you're enthused, it's sunny out, and you just have a burst of energy and you tend to just push too hard. So I'm going to share a graph here, which I hope isn't too complicated looking. On the bottom line is just time, and on the vertical line is sort of stress, or think of that as exercise or activity. And let's say this blue line is just sort of your daily activity levels. And if we gradually become more active, our body will adapt and we won't exceed this sort of red line, which is our adaptation capacity. That's sort of, think of that as the injury line. If we go over that line, we're exceeding our body's ability to adapt and get stronger, and that's where we get injured. So with any activity program, we're trying to just gradually get more and more active, get our muscles and joints and bones and tendons used to that, as well as our cardiovascular system, and sort of just make sure we do a nice gradual progression. But it's very easy to sort of, some days you might have had a poor sleep, maybe you're not properly hydrated, and maybe you just pushed a bit too hard, and we go over that line and end up with some symptoms, which might start off just with some aching or discomfort. But if we don't manage that properly, maybe that will, evolve into an actual injury. So just try to think of this graph, and with your walk run program, with any program, they try to structure it gradually so that your body will adapt and not get into trouble. But even the most well-designed program, people still get injured. So I see lots of people that train for the Sun Run, and even though it's a great program, their body may not just be able to adapt as quickly as that program's been laid out for them. And there's other people that adapt really quickly, and they could probably accelerate through the program without injury. So the trick really is sort of listening to your body. So I'll try to expand on that as we go. Are there any questions on that? Does that make sense? Great. So what are some of the risk factors for injury? And this is from research, so I've just tried to summarize it, not get too scientific about it. But there are personal factors, and unfortunately, one of them is the older we are, the more risk of injury. And that relates back to that adaptability. As we age, our body doesn't sort of rebound as quickly, and we have to be a bit more careful as we get older about how quickly we add on new activity. The other is body mass, and this is at either end of the spectrum. If you're, too heavy and carrying too much load, that's sort of extra stress on your joints and muscles, and that can be a risk factor for injury. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you're too light, if you don't have enough muscle mass, that can cause injuries. I like to think of the muscles as our shock absorbers, and if we don't have that muscle support to take that impact of walking and running, then our joints take more load and then they get sore. And when I see patients with osteoarthritis, say it's of their knee, we really emphasize trying to re-strengthen those muscles, strengthen those shock absorbers so that their joint's happier and they can sort of move on with their activity. Previous injuries, I've got a star beside, and this is actually probably the most relevant risk factor for injury. If you've been injured before, you've got a much more elevated risk of getting hurt again. And we see that lots where people have, strained a groin or pulled a hamstring, and they get into a cycle of repeatedly re-injuring that. And that's a complicated one. Sometimes it's inadequate rehab. Maybe they haven't had really good help in sort of recovering from their injury. Or a lot of times people also get to the point that I feel pretty good. I'm going to stop doing my exercises, and they sort of stop their rehab early and then they get re-injured. So just keep that in mind. If you've been injured before, just recognize that that is a risk factor, and you might have to be a bit careful with some of those areas. In the research as well, when they look at running experience, they do note that novice runners or novice walkers really are at an elevated risk, or even just having limited sports experience background, that is a risk for injury. And I think that relates to that adaptability sort of concept again, in terms of not having that lifelong pattern of loading and exercise. So those are the individual risk factors. The other can just be the training. And again, ideally with your program, this will sort of eliminate many of these risks. But we know that running higher mileages is a risk. So they've come up sort of with a threshold of about 64 kilometers per week. Once you start to get over that threshold, it is a risk of injury. Again, this is very individual. We'll see people that have over years built up a huge tolerance to running and walking great distances without trouble. They also found that if you run too many times per week or run only once a week, that's a risk for injury. And I certainly see, the classic weekend warriors that have maybe been sedentary most of the week. And then they go out for their, great big bike ride or a long run, and it's just too much for their body. They exceed that adaptation threshold. The other is some people train really intensely year round. They don't build in recovery. And this may or may not apply to you, but it is one thing to keep in mind, that well-designed training programs build in a recovery phase and let people just recover, let their body rebound, and then maximize sort of gains from their training. We do know that running on hard surfaces is an issue, and it can be a challenge depending on where you live. But ideally, try to minimize concrete as best you can. That's usually the worst surface. Pavement's a little bit better, but if you can find trail, that's even better. And ideally, just sort of altering your training surface is a good idea too. So try to mix it up a little bit. And this one I found interesting in the research, that a risk factor is just occasionally stretching. So if you just stretch maybe once a week, that's actually more of a risk factor than just not stretching at all, or stretch regularly. So either try to get into the habit of regular stretching, or I usually don't recommend this for people, don't stretch at all. But you can think about that as just the idea that if you just occasionally stretch, sometimes what happens is you might overstretch a little bit, just not knowing how far to stretch. And then now you're set up for risk of injury. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of the idea really is all about consistency. The next set of factors we think about are your biomechanics. It's just a fancy way of thinking about the forces and impacts that go through your body. So when we look at running, we know that a higher cadence, which means more steps per minute or just faster turnover, equals less injuries. And the reason for that really is, if you think of running with a long loping stride, each time you hit the ground, it's kind of like putting the brakes on. And that's a lot of force through your joints, muscles, and tendons. Whereas if you keep your foot underneath of you when you land, there's less braking impact force, and that is much easier on your body. So we just try to think turnover a little bit quicker. I think about this with cyclists as well. A lot of cyclists that have big, strong legs, they might tend to want to push a hard gear and pedal at a lower cadence, and that can overload their knees and hips, etc. Same thing for walking and running. A little bit faster turnover equals less injuries. And so that relates to the point below in terms of your technique. Forefoot striking, which means landing on the ball of your foot, does equal less injuries, but all of us have our own individual sort of running styles, and it's really can be a tricky thing to do to change your running technique. So we always say, be cautious about suddenly changing. If you're normally a heel striker, be careful about suddenly going to your forefoot, because then you can overload your calf and your Achilles tendon. But if you do work on your cadence by running a bit faster, you'll naturally go towards a midfoot or a forefoot strike. But do it gradually. Again, think of it as more loading on your foot muscles and on your calf muscles. So just be cautious with that when you do change your technique, but just be mindful of it. And it does apply to walking as well. If you can go a little bit faster with your walking, you'll find that you're less likely to get injured. When it comes to equipment with walking and running, luckily we don't have a lot of equipment to think about. The main thing really is your shoes. And some people will be very diligent with tracking their mileage on their shoes, which can be very helpful. Because sometimes just looking at a shoe, you can't really tell if it's worn out. That foam in the shoe may look good, but it's probably, in many cases, it can have lost its sort of shock absorption. Some people will consider having multiple pairs of the same running shoe, which can be quite expensive to do, but it is a good thing to try to keep in mind, having multiple pairs of shoes. Let one set of shoes recover from the run you've given them and switch to the next set of shoes. But they would be the same shoe style. Try not to switch shoe styles. The other, you may be aware, there's sort of a whole spectrum of shoes. There's maximalist shoes, which are the really cushiony ones, like you're running on a cloud. And then there's minimalist shoes, which have much less support. Your heel's a bit lower. And when they look at the research on those, you actually get fewer injuries with the more minimal shoes. But you really have to be careful about switching to that style of shoe. So you have to make sure that you've done some strength work and preparatory work if you're going to switch to that type of shoe. But just keep that in mind. If your shoe's working for you, you're not having any injuries, don't change it. Just sort of carry on with that shoe. The frustrating thing is that shoe manufacturers will often change the model from year to year, and then you're searching for another shoe. But once you found a good shoe, you'll find a lot of people will sort of stick to that one. The million-dollar question often is, well, what's the best shoe for me? And in my training, in my early years as a physio, we would often look at the foot structure. And if you had a high arch, we would, specify this type of shoe. If you had a low arch, we'd specify this type of shoe. But what's interesting in the research now is they sort of say, go with the shoe that feels the best. Go with based on comfort. And I think that's a pretty good rule to follow. Unless you have, let's say, a more unique foot. Let's say if you've got a really extremely high arch or really flattened out foot, or maybe you've got a bunion or some other previous injury to your foot, then certainly seek out some help from a really reputable shoe store. Get some advice on that. So that's really important. So any history of injuries, if you've got maybe an atypical foot, get some help with that. So I won't lecture you too much about shoes. That's sort of a whole nother topic in itself. But that's an important piece of equipment for your walking and running. Are there any questions so far? Just want to make sure you're okay.
We're totally fine. Everybody's listening. I was going to just remind everybody, and those of you may not know, that together with this program, Brooks Running Shoes has offered a 20% discount on a select number of stores. We can give you that information further, but they've targeted various stores around the province so that we can sort of be close to most communities. And if that doesn't work for you, Susan and I will figure out a way to get you the shoes that you need just through mail or what have you, if to make that happen. So that's really helpful to know.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I won't give you a detailed lecture about all the different injuries, but what are some of the common discomforts and injuries? From the top down, it sort of goes in this sort of version. Number one really is shin splints. Sorry, my poor dog here is whining away. I'm just gonna let my dog out. Take 1 second. I'm really sorry. Max, come here.
No worries. It'll give me a chance to also jump in here, because I loved, of course, what Tyler was suggesting about the importance of cadence and how you land. And just a reminder, if you're embarking on the Learn to Run program, that, we've always talked about a quicker turnover. Remember that we talk about a quicker turnover so that you'll land under your base of support with, and more than likely that way, either a mid to forefoot landing, probably midfoot mostly, but it allows you to roll forward then onto your forefoot, and you'll minimize injury. You won't overstride. And those are simple terms that support the fact that it'll keep you healthier. So I'm just glad, Tyler, your words support what they're told.
Yeah. And what I would say is, I do agree that midfoot's probably for most people, probably the best bet. I think if you go to 4-foot, even though the research sort of says 4-foot, I think you can get in trouble with too much 4-foot running. So just think about getting your foot underneath of you when you're running and not out in front of you. Otherwise, you're just putting on the brakes and then having to accelerate again and putting on the brakes and accelerating. So just keep that foot under you, and it's like having the gas pedal just at the set speed, and that'll help you stay out of trouble. Well, sorry for the intermission there, but thanks. So just listing off the injuries, shin splints is usually number one, and that's just on the inside edge of your tibia bone down here in the leg, and that's where your muscle, your calf muscle, connects to your shin, and that can just get overloaded and start to become sore. The second most common is your Achilles tendon, which is this big tendon at the back of your calf that connects to your heel bone, and those muscles help you push off when you run. And unfortunately, it's one of those ones that really tends to get overloaded easily. The next way up the chain here we look at is the patellar tendon, which is your thigh muscles at the front are called your quadriceps, and they connect to your kneecap or your patella. There's a tendon that just goes below that, but that whole system is sort of what takes the impact when you run, helps absorb the forces, but that patellar tendon can get sore. If we move down again, we're back at the bottom of the foot. There's a structure called the plantar fascia. Think of it like a hammock or a sling that supports your foot. And there's a few things that put you at risk for that, but it's commonly gives you some arch pain, and especially pain in the morning when you first stand on it. And there's lots of factors that cause it, but that is a common one. And then for a lot of people, actually a common acute injury is they sprain their ankle while running. They just don't maybe have the muscular support, or maybe they don't have the balance or control, or they just had bad luck and they step on a pebble or a stone or off a curb and they sprain their ankles. That is a common one. So that's more of an acute injury versus these other ones, which are more chronic long-term injuries. The IT band is a big band on the side of your thigh, and sorry you can't see it on this diagram, but it's on the side of your thigh, and that typically gives you a sharp pain on the outside of your knee. And there's lots of factors that cause that, but again, that's sort of one of the common overuse injuries. And then lastly in the group here, the hamstrings, the big muscles in the back of your thigh that help propel you forward, is another common area. So a lot of lower body, obviously it's all lower body, but a lot relate to the foot and ankle. So if you have specific questions about those injuries, I can talk about that at the end. So what are the injury prevention strategies? I know you've probably know a lot of this, so I'm going to go over this fairly quickly. But in your program, some kind of a dynamic warm-up, get your heart rate up, get your tissues warmed up, and get moving. So we sort of moved away from the static warm-up where you just sort of stood around, did a few stretches, and then got going. We make sure we get our heart rate up and get our core temperature up. A proper cool down is probably built in as well. We would never sort of ride a horse full pace and then just sort of throw it in the barn and close the barn door. We want to properly cool down the system so we don't have soreness or injury. So always think about that cool down. Some of the advice I'm sure you've been given along the way would be to start slow. And Lynn had mentioned at the beginning that sort of conversational pace is a nice way to sort of gauge your effort level. And certainly when you get into more advanced training, you are huffing and puffing and doing harder intervals. But in the beginning, we're just thinking about that conversational pace and just building gradually. And think about that adaptation graph I showed you. I think it's good to vary the surfaces you're on. I think it's always wise to build in some recovery days. We need to, that training is sort of a stimulus to sort of cause our body to make changes. We want to give that recovery time there so our body can do it. And I have walking here is okay, just saying that if you're doing the running program, it's okay to pause and walk if you need to. It's best just to keep moving. So don't feel like you failed if you've had to stop and walk. Walking is fine. You're still getting exercise and stimulus. So just keep that in mind. There are lots of recovery strategies, and some have more or less effect on you. I've got a big list here of things like foam rolling, stretching, hydration, nutrition, and sleep. And probably number one for many people is just getting good sleep. If you can do that, you've covered off. You're probably going to get the most bang for your buck versus spending a lot of time foam rolling and stretching. If you can just get a good sleep, that helps your body. But they're all important. It's always easier said than done. That sleep part is always a tough one. for people. And then a term that we use is prehab. And the idea is waiting, you don't want to wait till you're injured and have to go to rehab. Ideally, you want to do some prehab. So consider addressing any strength or flexibility issues that you might have prior to a program. It's not always possible, but let's say if you've got a history of quite a few injuries along the way, it might be a good idea to see your healthcare professional and just have them screen you, see if there's any things that you might want to target and work on a bit before you do the program or even during the program. So we just use the term prehab. You're trying to be proactive and take care of any trouble spots before you get into injury. And then just a reminder that everyone responds differently to loading and training. So monitor yourself. A logbook is really helpful. Some people will, not only write down their mileage and their time, but also how they felt that day, any niggles or sore spots that they might have had. And that way they can sort of track it and sort of be ready if something shows up. So the title of the slide is sort of discomfort versus pain versus injury. And the word pain has such a powerful meaning to people. And I sometimes try to avoid the word pain unless it truly is a pain. But that's why I'm sort of going to emphasize discomfort. So that could be aching and throbbing and a variety of descriptions. But I'll sort of try to talk about this spectrum. And the beginning might just be some discomfort. It progresses to pain. Then we know that getting into trouble, and that eventually that could lead to injury. So with any kind of fitness program, not only walking, running, but a lot of times you'll get going on it and you're going to start to maybe feel some discomfort or aches or pains. And you might be thinking to yourself, should I continue or is this going to get me into trouble? Am I going to get hurt? And should I keep going? So I'm going to give you some little questions you can ask yourself to decide whether or not you need to stop, walk it off, or pause the program or seek some help. So I'll try to give you some tips for that. So yeah, just sort of summarizing, when are you just experiencing discomfort? Or are you just putting yourself at risk for injury? So that's a tricky one to decide sometimes. So here's the 3 questions you can ask yourself. Number 1 is, did I have any difficulty finishing my last walk or run? So was that a real struggle? Did I have any aches or pains that lasted more than a couple days? And am I feeling really tired the day after my walk or run? And am I able to complete sort of my daily activities? Am I having sort of really run down day? And if you have no to all those questions, then certainly keep on going. But if you have a yes to any of those questions, then you have to sort of pay attention to that and think, first of all, you might say, okay, I'm not going to increase my intensity or mileage or do a harder workout until I sort of can say no to all those questions. And once I can do that, then I can carry on. If you can't really get to the point you can say no to those questions, then definitely get some help. See your chiropractor, your physician, your physio, whoever your healthcare person is, get some help with that.
I have a question that
Yes.
especially during this pandemic time, there are just all these different stresses that people are experiencing. So what would you say to a person that is embarking on this walk run journey, but let's say they really are having trouble sleeping?
Yes.
So, it is a common thing right now. But yet we're told, oh, but it's so good to get outside and, do some exercise, maybe do a walk or a run. What would you say to a person who is in that situation? They're tired because they're not sleeping, but it's this cycle.
Yeah.
But
it's an interesting point. Right now I'm as busy as I've ever been at the clinic right now. We have lots of people that are, under this sort of chronic level of stress, and sometimes trying to add on an exercise program may be more stress. But I think of it as, there's negative stresses and positive stresses. And generally we think of exercise as sort of that positive stress, which sort of helps you. And we see many people, that are in low energy states. They're kind of down. And if they could just initiate some exercise and activity, that usually makes a huge difference for them. But the challenge is knowing when you're too run down and when you should actually stop or not. There's a few ways to look at it. If you want to be a bit more scientific, you could track your resting heart rate. Some people will look at their morning resting heart rate, and if you see it's elevated, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 beats above their normal resting heart rate, then they might say, you know what, I think my body's a bit overstressed. I'm either going to take a rest day or just a really light day for training. The sleep part is a big, big issue, and that comes down to things like sleep hygiene, trying to minimize that screen time before bed, getting sort of a good routine of nighttime, consistent bedtimes, is a tough one. And certainly, limiting caffeine use after a certain time in the day. It is a tricky one. I think it's individual, Lynn. I think
in general, would you still, I mean, of course it's individual and it depends on the severity of a situation, but
yep.
in general, reducing any sort of intensity, just take the pace, whether it's walking or running, and just reduce that, but still experience the goodness in a good stress in moving.
Yes. Yeah, I would certainly say if you're not having, these intense pain, like in terms of the pain and injury stuff, you're not having those kind of symptoms, it's just sort of fatigue, then I'd say just take it down a notch or two, continue moving, continue getting outside, getting fresh air, and doing all those positive aspects of keeping moving.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. It's a tricky time right now for lots of people. Where was that? I think I covered this slide. Let's go to the next one here. And so during your activity, during your walking or run, you might have discomfort that comes on, and the timing of it can be something to think about. So the first situation you might have is you might have some discomfort in the warm-up. So you're just doing the initial warm-up before your workout and you get some discomfort. And I tell all my patients, if you have some discomfort during the warm-up, that's okay, as long as it sort of eases off in the warm-up and goes away, then carry on with the workout. But monitor that. So it just might mean sort of a hint that maybe something's brewing, but watch it. But as long as it goes away in the warm-up, carry on. What if that discomfort returns during the workout? Well, there's a couple things you could do. You could pause, maybe do a walk break, stop and do some stretching, let your heart rate come down, and maybe resume the activity. And if the pain goes away, then great, carry on with that session. If the pain comes back again, though, that's a red flag to sort of shut it down, head back to home, and sort of monitor those symptoms. In terms of treatment, it is specific to the injuries. Let's say you rolled your ankle. That's an acute injury, and definitely that is something you want to ice and elevate and rest and follow those typical guidelines. If it's more some ache and discomfort, you don't necessarily have to ice, but if you do notice some redness, some heat, some warmth to the area, then certainly ice it. So this is where maybe you would take a day or two off, do some gentle stretching or foam rolling, and get some good sleep and just try to recover and monitor what happens. So that's kind of the first stage where you get a bit of discomfort in the warm-up, and you can usually proceed if that goes in the warm-up. The next stage is if you get that discomfort during the actual workout session. The first rule I have is that discomfort should never be more than a 4 out of 10 on that scale of, 0 is no discomfort and 10 is the worst you can imagine or experience. So that should never be more than a 3 or 4 out of 10. And the other thing I say is it shouldn't be impacting how you move. So if you're actually limping or favoring or altering how you move, plus you have discomfort at a 4 out of 10, that means you need to bring it down a notch, go back to walking and see if that sort of eases off. But if it carries on, then we need to take care of that. And if that discomfort's more than a 4 out of 10 for more than 2 days, then consider having that looked at by your healthcare professional. If it hasn't really come down after a couple of days of being nice to it, and then it might mean you do have a true overuse injury there. The next thing that might happen is you might have discomfort that just comes on, shortly after your walk or run. So say within a couple hours of your session, that's less than a 4 out of 10. What it means is maybe just take it down a notch the next day, but you usually should be okay to carry on with the workout. But again, if it's that pain is not dissipating and not coming down within a couple of days, then get some help. Another common thing that you can get when you initiate any kind of fitness program is something called DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. I'm sure some of us have experienced that. You maybe haven't lifted weights for a while and your muscles are really sore the next day. That's just a result of some micro injury to the muscle, and there's a bit of inflammation that goes with that, but that's actually a positive thing. It's making your muscle adapt and get better. So as long as that soreness is in the muscles and it comes on, a day after the session, and sometimes it lasts a couple of days if you've really overdone it or trained hard, it is usually something you can generally train through. So you might take it down a notch if you're sore, but you can usually keep active and think of that as a good soreness. If that discomfort or pain is at your joints, so that's a different thing to think about. So if it's in the muscles, think of DOMS, just a good soreness. You're making your muscles stronger. So just a couple points to summarize then is to just be aware of your own individual risk factors. And again, previous injury is a big one. Follow well-designed programs. So certainly that's happening already. But again, keep in mind, we all adapt at different rates. And unfortunately, as we get older, we don't adapt as quickly. Or if we have any underlying other health conditions like diabetes, for example, we tend to have to be a bit more careful with how we load and begin a training program. Think about monitoring your response to your training, and what goes along with that is sort of listening to your body. And Lyndon said that right from the beginning too, is I think just with practice and time, you can get better at learning how your body's talking to you and what those sorenesses and stiffness and aches and pains mean. And a logbook is helpful for that, to sort of track that down. So just start to listen to your body and get a sense of how you're feeling and try to get in tune with that. And if you haven't been active for a while, it can take a little while to sort of regain your sort of sense of what your body's doing and telling you. And of course, if you're getting into pain levels above 4 out of 10, that's not resolving after a couple of days, then get some help for sure. So I've got lots of time for questions if anyone has any questions.
Awesome.
I have a question. So I am recovering from a meniscus tear from October.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a tear that took me out. Like I was like, it locked, and I had to get sedated for it to straighten. And
Yeah.
I was on crutches for a while. I didn't recover fully, like right away.
Yeah.
So I'm walking. I'm on week 7 now, but I'm just, there's a fear around re-injuring. Like I just want to make sure, because I've had to train my leg to walk normally again, because it still had, like, it wasn't able to bend or straighten.
Okay.
So any tips around that? And I would really love to do yoga, but like I can't bend it. Like I can't sit cross-legged right now.
Yes.
So any tips around meniscus tear?
Yeah, for sure. So you didn't have surgery, right, Danielle? No surgery?
No.
No, okay. And sorry, it happened in the fall?
Yeah.
And how did it happen?
It was really strange. Like all I was doing was getting into my vehicle. So my right leg got into my vehicle and I was getting in and it locked. It's very strange.
Yeah. No, a lot of times it's those awkward movements, like a twisting, turning, that will catch those meniscuses. What I would say is, from a physio standpoint, is what I want to see there be no swelling in your knee. So hopefully there's no swelling that's lingering in your knee. If there is, it's fine to be walking, but if there's a lot of swelling, we wouldn't have you running on it. And does your knee fully straighten now, so you don't have an obvious limp or anything?
It's almost fully, so there definitely is a lot more strength in my knee, but bending it to a full 45-degree, unable. But I think the straightening is getting a lot better.
Good. Yeah, I would say in general, walking is a good activity for that, because it's a fairly straight ahead motion. You're not pivoting or twisting, and you've got low impact. So as long as you're not getting any negative effects from it, just not swelling and getting extra stiff, I would certainly carry on walking. I might be a bit cautious with like turning quickly or being on really uneven ground. Your knee might not like that for now. The bike would be a great option for cross training right now, and that usually really helps with the meniscus. as well as swimming, but that may not be an option right now. But with swimming, I'd say don't do breaststroke, the whip kick from breaststroke. That really causes a lot of twisting with the knee. So it's usually the twisting motions or really forcing the bend that will sort of aggravate that. So if you're doing yoga poses, what I say is be careful of poses that either twist your knee. So the example might be pigeon pose. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But anything that kind of twists on the knee, or anything that really forces your knee to fully bend right now. So that would be like child's pose, sitting all the way back on your heels. That may aggravate the joint a bit. So bend it, in a nice straight path, but avoid twisting for now. Yeah, and a good yoga instructor will, be aware of meniscus and will modify poses for you to sort of avoid irritating that joint. And you've had some rehab help with it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah. So it sounds like you're not having any negative effects from your walking. I would certainly continue on, forge ahead with that. Just be careful of twisting and turning, and maybe too uneven a ground might bother it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great.
Further to just what was discussed, I was thinking about swelling generally. Like if a person just, actually felt fine, maybe, but the body reacts and somehow there is a swelling. What it's common. What should they do?
You might see there's a few different locations where swelling could happen. If it's at a joint, like the knee, it might be like your knee looks full. It might be stiff to bend. You might have a hard time contracting some of your muscles around that knee. If it's swelling at a joint, we really do watch that. That's sort of a sign that joint's been irritated and overloaded. And we have to be respectful of that swelling. And that swelling is kind of trapped in what we call a joint capsule. I think of our joints like a water balloon. We normally have some fluid in there that lubricates the joint, which is good for it. But if we irritate or injure a joint, it kind of balloons up and it fills with this fluid. And it doesn't have any quick way to get out of there. You can't, what they used to do 30 years ago was stick a needle in there and drain it out, but they don't do that anymore because it's a risk of infection. So what you have to do when you have joint swelling is just really unload it a bit and do something low impact like cycling or swimming and wait for that swelling to come down. If it's swelling, say you strained a muscle and you've got swelling around a muscle, that's a different one, and that usually comes down fairly quickly. And that would begin your rehab program of sort of gradually reloading once the acute inflammation is settled. So you might initially be doing the ice compression elevation sort of routine to settle that down. And you might need some guidance on that if you've really had a significant muscle tear. The other type of swelling you can see is a sort of thickening of the tendons. So for example, the Achilles tendon will sometimes start to thicken up. And that's usually a sign of some degeneration of the tendon. And that one has to be monitored in a certain way. But I would say monitor any swelling, especially if it's at a joint. That's really important to monitor and get some help with. If it's within the muscles and it dissipates pretty quickly and there wasn't an incident of a really sharp pull or strain, you didn't feel something pop, then you can usually self-manage that but make sure it's trending in the right direction. Is that okay, Lynn?
Awesome. No, I have many questions, but I would love it if those of you that are joining us now, if there's anything at all, you can bet others have thought about it.
Yeah.
One thing, what about like calf cramps?
Oh, yes. Good one. Yes. Good question. Yeah, cramping is an interesting phenomenon. Classically, they would blame that on electrolyte depletion, that you didn't have enough electrolytes. So they recommend things like Gatorade or other products like that to get your electrolytes up. But that's usually not the case unless you're doing really extreme distances and getting really dehydrated. Cramping is usually a sign of sort of what we call neurological fatigue, that the muscle is not used to that kind of activity. So there's a couple of things you can do. If you're having a cramp, the best thing you can do is try to gently stretch that muscle back out. Don't let it stay in a cramped position because that will just sort of get worse. So say if it's your calf that's cramping, do a standard calf stretch where you might lean against a wall or a fence post and try to stretch out the back of your lower leg. Or if it's really cramping, sometimes you can have another person get a hold of your leg and bend your ankle the other way, so it takes that cramp away. And if you have a strong enough cramp, you can actually cause a bit of muscle injury and have some soreness that lasts for a few days. But to prevent cramping, a lot of it comes down to proper conditioning and strengthening. So if you do have a history of a lot of calf cramps, again, this is without assessing the person, but I would often recommend some calf strengthening exercises, as well as some calf mobility exercises, which might be foam rolling or stretching.
Okay, could it have anything to do with hydration?
In some cases, yes, but usually it's not.
Okay.
Unless you're sort of chronically dehydrated. So that dehydration and electrolyte theory really doesn't seem to have support in the research. It can, certainly for long distance events, and maybe you're already going into an activity dehydrated, it might be a factor, but it's usually related to just lack of proper conditioning of those muscles. And if we strengthen them up and work on some flexibility, that usually stops them from happening. There are some other more rare conditions that cause it, but that's the most common thing, is just need to get your muscles used to that activity again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's no harm in hydrating more, and it's no harm in taking Gatorade. No harm in doing that, but it may not be the actual cause of the problem, but no harm in doing those.
Yeah, because I do have some group members, like literally, I don't think they ever drink water.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So this is a problem I'm always having with as particular a couple of the male members in our group.
Yeah, gosh.
Trying to get them to drink water.
Yeah. Well, that certainly could be the dehydration issue then in that case. If they're just coming into the situation already dehydrated, then that's an issue. And I guess, so are they all encouraged to bring a water bottle and drink along the way?
I bring water bottles and hand them out.
Good for you. Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like in that case, it may be a dehydration issue. Yeah. So,
and I've even gotten to the point where, okay, after our walk, if your water bottle's empty, your name will go in for a draw prize of
good for you.
Incentives always work.
Yes, that's perfect. So, yeah. Good point. That's a tricky one.
Somebody actually mentioned plantar fasciitis.
Yes.
There, and I also have flat feet, so I worry about that. My mom walking, she usually gets that as well. So it's the best to remedy that.
Right. Well, the first thing I'd say about having flat feet is flat feet isn't necessarily a problem. If you look at many elite runners, for example, Kenyan runners, most of them have very flat feet. So it's not necessarily a problem with the foot structure, although we often will blame it on that. It's usually some strengthening of those small foot muscles that can help with that. So again, with a proper training program, those muscles will strengthen as you do more activity. But sometimes as a physio, we'll prescribe specific toe strengthening exercises. An example might be, putting a towel down on the floor and trying to pick up that towel with your toes, or picking up marbles and trying to strengthen those toe muscles. The other risk factor for it is having tight calf muscles. So we do classically give some calf stretches for that, as well as some stretches for the plantar fascia. And there's ways of, having your toes bend back, plus adding the ankle stretch to stretch your plantar fascia a little bit. But having flat feet in themselves isn't necessarily a big risk factor. I think what the risk factor more is just usually just doing too much too soon. So again, just following the training program will keep you out of trouble. But if you do know you have some real tightness in your calves, you might maybe get on top of that and start to stretch those a little bit. And again, the footwear is something to think about. But again, the consensus really is going for the most comfortable shoes. It also depends what you're doing on your feet outside of walking or running. So if you work in a setting where you're standing on concrete all day and you may not be in the best shoes, that can be a factor too. So just try to be aware of all the activity you do on your feet. And if you're getting symptoms, look at what you're doing in terms of standing and stretching, etc. So that's a big topic, but hopefully that helps you a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to run out of time, but I want to pick up on just this a general thought process around flexibility and just general body strength to help prevent injury. I wonder, Tyler, if you could even prescribe a few, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 really basic things that would help a person build some body strength that would help, some prevention. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the ones that would give you the most bang for your buck is I call it a chair squat, or some people call it air squat.
Mm-hmm.
So just on, 2 feet about shoulder width apart, have the chair behind you. And the cue is that you're going to sit down, but not quite. Some people call it the hover squat. So you're just going to sit almost into the chair, but not quite there, and just hold that position. Emphasize equal weight on both your feet, and just hold that. If you hold that for 10 seconds or more, you should feel some muscles burning. And that's a nice, easy way just to address some general leg strength. And if you get good at that, then do that on one leg. And when you think about running, each time you run, you're sort of landing on one leg. It has to absorb that force. So doing single leg squats, you might start shallow and emphasize, again, your hip going back. Don't point your knees forward. So with any kind of squat, we try to think of not overloading our knees. We want to use our big hip muscles and really hinge at the hips. So a chair squat or air squat are great, as well as some single leg squats to work on balance and strengthening those foot muscles and ankle muscles. So that's one of the most useful ones, I would say. The other would be strengthening your calves. And you could start with just 2 feet on the stairs, just doing up and down heel raises. And when they become easy, then work on single leg heel raises. And with both of those, make sure you just don't start doing hundreds of reps every day, because you'll start to overload things. But with any activity program, we know that that strength training really does help prevent injuries. So that's a big emphasis for a lot of runners and walkers, is to do some strength work. The other muscle group, if I were to pick a third one, is the muscles on the side of your hips. The fancy name for it is your gluteus medius. What I might do would be a lateral lunge. So step to the side into a lunge. So you sort of lower that one leg. That's an easy way to sort of functionally strengthen those lateral muscles. But when you do a single leg squat, you're working those lots as well. If you happen to have a band, we often put a band around your ankles and just do some side stepping, or crab walking might be a way to think about it. Just sort of side stepping with the band to strengthen those hip muscles. There's lots of other muscle groups you could think of, but I think if you just focus on some squatting and some calf raises, you'll hit a lot of key muscles right there just with a couple exercises. From a stretching standpoint, again, try to get into a routine. The risk factors, if you just stretch once a week, you're at risk for injury. So it's better to sort of consistently stretch a little bit. And the key muscle groups usually are your calf muscles, your thigh muscles at the front, and your hamstrings, as well as your hips. But some general stretching is good. Great question, Lynn.
Oh, wonderful. Honestly, there would be many, many more. As you know, this is always a helpful conversation, and we really appreciate your wisdom and your, all of the things that you've shared here today, Tyler. So
you're welcome.
Thank you for joining us. We do have a draw prize, Susan. Yes, and everybody, this will be recorded, and do share this. This is such an informative webinar. We'll make it available to you with a link, but hopefully you can share it with your participants, and it's then watchable at any time. You'll think, what did he say again about, what was that? What were those strength exercises? What's the signs and symptoms I need to look for? So I would encourage you, we'll just keep this as a resource for you. Thanks again, Tyler.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone. And enjoy your walk run programs. I hope you guys are all doing great. And thanks for this opportunity to speak.